Welcome to the lab, where our goal is simple. We want to advance liberation one conversation at a time. I'm honored to have my guest, my brother Ben. And we're going to be talking about what it means to unpack whiteness and his journey through it all. Should be a fascinating conversation. Welcome to the lab, y'all. Ben,
Hey, Bobby.
what's up, sir?
Glad to be here, pushing through the school year.
Aren't we all, brother? I just got to spring break. Thank God. I didn't know if I was going to make it, Ben. It was a lot. But for people that don't know you, why don't you tell people who you are, what you do, and why you do it?
Awesome. Yep. Ben Bruhn out in Oregon, teaching social studies, sometimes an avid class and language arts, helping out with credit recovery. So a lot of different hats. And yeah, so I've been out in my specific school for this is my fourth year. Before then was up in Washington, kind of hopped in different settings. And why I do it, is man, it's always a thing I come back to, that why. One is just a shirt behind me. Shout out to different people, this deficit narratives, just wanting to disrupt that. And so that makes learning, of course, more fun when you're not getting a boring narrative. And the real one actually is a bit more engaging than the fake one that is spread around so often. And then just kind of humanizing it. So especially in this pandemic, Bobby, it's been that why of like, how do I help myself and my students kind of stay human in a pretty dehumanizing, structure right now.
Yeah, I think there's so much there. You know, shout out to our sister Shauna for the disrupting narratives, that's deficit narratives. I think I've been talking a lot about this idea of disruption through the liberated educator cohort, meeting with teachers, and one of the things that we constantly come back to as we talk about what that looks like in our classrooms and is that disruption has to start with self, right? That I can't ever disrupt what I see in the world or in systems or in interpersonal relationships or in in the like unless I can see it in me. Um would you agree with that statement? And if so, how have you begun or in this ongoing work that we all are on of disrupting um within ourselves?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, there's so much like unlayering. I mean, I think a lot of times, like in teacher school, there might be a little bit of that of saying like, "Hey, you should get to know your kids and kind of remember what was confusing when you were in school, or remember the peer pressure." So I think there's a certain layer that as teachers, we're kind of taught to acknowledge, even if it's like, I should do this, we do it together, you do it. Um, but there's a lot more to that I think has taken years for me to again peel back some more layers to it,
Mm.
because you just don't know what you don't know, and oftentimes it's not until you stretch yourself that you realize a gap. Just like a muscle where I'm like, oh, I could lift that. Like, wait, never mind, I really can't lift that. And you're sore and you kind of remember that. And you're like, oh yeah, why wasn't I able to lift that? So I know for me with that deeper identity work, it honestly began really just with even seeing professionally, how am I showing up? Personally, how am I showing up?
Mm.
And I know that is like a broader cultural thing of like, do we wish we could just turn it off? Um, And I think as educators, sometimes we think of like, hey, for the kids means almost like we're paying you to be inauthentic.
Mm.
Let's just have smiles all the time and positivity and not necessarily knowing that line of like, especially this year, I feel like that line of growth mindset and also reality check. And so am I just almost having a toxic positivity, or am I willing to just say like, yeah, like I'm not feeling it today? And um, so I know for me, my family culture and my MO for a long time was um, not quite toxic positivity, but like I just need to be steady. I need to be strong. I need to kind of be there for other people, to the point where I wouldn't always even be honest with myself, like I'm tired. Um, and so I realized for me, there was a lot of overlap in an unhealthy way. Like at school and at home, I'm serving, give, 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 give. That even pausing to ask myself, how are you doing? um, I needed space. And some of that stage of life, like with kids and lack of sleep and kind of the grind of family life sometimes. But I know for me in education, um, that vulnerability wasn't modeled for me. And I don't always see that vulnerability of saying, yeah, that lesson wasn't really good. And I agree with you, students. um, and but also celebrating like, yeah, that really row, and I didn't expect that, and that reciprocal side of like, there's a lot I can't control, and um, letting kids be in on that celebration, but also maybe a disappointment sometimes.
And to do that, there's a level of, as you said, just vulnerability, letting the guard down. I think about, for me, in the process of like letting my guard down, I've realized that sometimes the difficulty comes in not letting it down, but keeping it down. And why do I say that? Just because sometimes I don't like what I see on the other side. Sometimes, like I'm interrogating things about myself that I don't really care for, or that I wish would have changed, or that I'm stuck in. Right? When I say let my guard down, I mean if if I am functioning in this continual state of positivity and perfectionism, then I'm never really going to look at myself with fresh eyes on who I really am and where I need to grow. And so, for me, I've had to kind of unpack perfectionism as it relates to how I even see myself. And so, I want to ask you, based off of the heels of that, is, you know, we've known each other for some time now, and you've always kind of shared with me the journey that you've been on of unlearning and unpacking, whiteness. Now, I said that, and whoever's listening right now is probably triggered, Ben.
Right.
So let's back up for a second. Can you help us define the terms? When I say whiteness and you hear it, what do you hear? Especially as a white man in America. Like, what do you hear when I say that?
Yeah. Whew, there's a lot there. I think like for me, part of that triggering is even just acknowledging a discomfort. Like that feels awkward. That feels
Mm,
weird. There could be a defensiveness of like, would I go around saying blackness or like
mm,
Asianness? And so that's where I can get my head with all these like kind of counter arguments, and I realize the shields are kind of coming up, um, before even just acknowledging like that doesn't land well. I don't like that. Um, and I think as a social studies teacher, it's one thing to talk about like white culture that feels safer, that feels
mm,
more like I understand that when we're talking about how is culture in the US different than culture in France or culture in Brazil. Um, but the whiteness, I realized for me, it just really quickly triggers a sense of identity. Um,
mm,
and then that's where I feel like it can be a threat of, is this, a sense of who I am that I can't change. Um,
mm,
and therefore, it might not be my fault. Um, but also might feel like, are you setting this bar where I need to like deny who I am? As if like it's my fault I was born with this genetic background or that I had this history. Um, so for me, just thinking back when you mentioned that definition, it was one reason one of my first connections with Dr. Kate Slater was me seeing a post and just in a DM sliding in and be like, hey, when you had this quote with Dr. Angel Jones on whiteness, like that really helped me. And can I get that quote? And then she actually responded and said, yeah, that you're right. There's a lot to unpack that. And I think her next post was actually her definition.
Mm.
Uh, but what stood out to me in her conversation on IG Live with Dr. Angel Jones was just around it being a way of being. It's a way of behavior. And so for me, that helped me realize like I can change my behavior. Sorry for that interruption. Um, so that way of being helped me see like this, there's a spectrum, something I can divest from.
Mm.
So way of being like me being a jerk when I'm tired, me being maybe anxious and me having some kind of behavior connected to that. Yeah, I realized you can kind of minimize the impact of it, so I realized like white being part of that, there's a history there.
Mm.
There's power there.
Mm.
And so I realized I needed to stick with that discomfort. So it was enough that Dr. Cate's definition helped me know I can process this in a different way rather than it being a good, bad binary.
Yeah.
But like, can I kind of confess when my behavior messes up? I'm not perfect, like you were saying. Can I
Yeah.
say to you, Bobby, like, yeah, man, I messed up and I'm sorry? Or am I going to arm up and pretend I didn't do it or deny it? So whiteness for me was just that recognition that there's a conditioned way of behavior that I'm unconscious of. And how can I be more conscious of it is the really humbling part of needing other people. I can't retreat into my journal. I can't retreat into some book. I really need something to disrupt me to see what I can't see. And that's humbling to realize after 30 years of living and education, quote unquote, because in and out of school, where I haven't been taught to look at myself and why am I behaving that way? Um, so a lot of that unlayering took vulnerability. It took a connection for me to realize, behavior and knowing like, hey, I have thought about my behavior and I know I mess up. I may not know what that means with whiteness yet, but I do know what that means in general, that I do mess up. And if I just deny ever messing up, I'm probably not going to get an authentic connection with people. My wife, my kids, my students. Um, so it's a long answer for you, but that shift, I think it was helpful to find other people articulate that shift. So Ibram Kendi, like again, finding other people articulating that shift to confession or denial. And a
Mm.
quote I keep coming back to is just like kind of that heartbeat of racism being that denial, and the heartbeat of anti-racism being that confession. And I'd love to avoid confession because it doesn't. It's embarrassing. It's humiliating to say I messed up. Even if there's no audience, just for me to know for myself, I know when it's being performative and when am I genuinely trying to engage.
Mm.
And I
Mm.
might not even have someone call me out, but can I confess to myself that post, that conversation, that response was maybe performative when I wanted recognition instead of actually honoring the impact that I want to disrupt or engage. But I knew if I don't do that for me, then I can't just wait for other people. It's going to be extrinsic. And I needed that intrinsic, just like all those other behaviors, that intrinsic of I can be imperfect and my value is not tied to that perfection.
Mm.
My performance, even if I mess up, even if other people don't call me out on messing up, am I going to call myself out? So for me, that helped me shift again from, whiteness and white supremacy traits are just designed to make you hollow, where what's on the outside is what needs to be seen and valued and performed. and what's inside is at least a liability, but at least shouldn't be a concern. Um, and the wholeness, again, had to be inside out, of actually seeing myself as a seed to cultivate rather than a mechanism to lubricate.
Mm, mm. So much there. You know, going back to, you sharing about how for you unpacking meant seeing yourself and being okay with the imperfection of the process, right? I can hear the vast number of trolls that I've had in my comments, even now as we're having this conversation, say things like, "So what you're telling me is that I have I'm racist or have racist tendencies, but I don't know that I'm racist." That seems like a very, hard sell. Or you're telling me that I have this thing called unconscious bias, and I don't know, and I need you to tell me if I am or am not. And so doesn't that just leave me at the mercy of folks who may not even know me, know my story? Um, and then along with that, I could just hear people desirous of just a change in terms because of the word itself, whiteness being um, deemed by many problematic. It focuses on skin color, but you tell me not to focus on skin color, but then we're focusing on skin color. I don't get it. All the objections, I can hear them. Um, while I will not put the pressure on you to have to dismantle all that at all, uh, I would like just, your thoughts around those things, right? One being the word whiteness, right? And the semantics of, do we change the word? Like, is that what it is? Is it just, or do we need to deal with it and have better understanding of what it means? Like, yeah, hope that makes sense.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, yeah, it is a lot there. And I know like what I'm going to share can, depending on the relationship, land as kind of coddling or backpedaling. Um, and so I think that's where I just mentioned there's going to be, I know for myself, I want a cookie cutter answer. I
Mm,
so often want some formula where, and I know there's a lot of the emotional labor where a lot of white folk like me will want that formula in advance without actually reflecting enough to know why.
yep.
Why do I want a cookie cutter response? Why do I want a formula? And I know a lot of times that's my impulse with discomfort is I really just want out of the discomfort. If you can give me a formula that makes me comfortable again, that can allow me to keep my shield, that can allow me to keep my power, my sense of control, I would love that formula. So if you can give me that formula, Bobby or Ben or Dr. Kate or whoever, that would be great. But I think a lot of times, I know for me, that impulse, there's so much discomfort. It's a defense mechanism instead of even know what am I defending?
Mm,
Why am I defending it? What's at stake? And so I know for me, just even sitting with how do I feel with the word white? What's at stake with that? How would I feel if it was a different word? Can I even think of an alternative that can capture what it's capturing? Am I using all of that as maybe a shield?
mm,
Um, and that takes time. Where I know for me, that's where it took earlier work to unpack this my emotional awareness. Like, do I even make space for my emotions? Or that discomfort, is that just a lifelong practice of suppression?
mm,
I think,
mm.
particularly as a male, an expectation of for me not to suppress makes me less male. If I have tears, if I show up, I know in my family culture is that if you did show emotions, it was a way of showing you lost the argument. Um,
Oh,
that if you are getting emotional and you're no longer able to, you know, keep all that in check, then it's clear someone won by getting under your skin, by
Mm.
stirring that up. Um, so I mentioned that because I think for me, a way of um, responding to someone's defensiveness is just being able to kind of almost lead backwards of saying, kind of here's how I felt when I first heard that word, and here are some things that have helped. And I think that's where a definition to help with Dr. Kate of getting some pieces to that big iceberg with the definition. So knowing, hey, whiteness as a way of behavior, being able to dissect that. So I know for a lot of us in our society, that perfectionism is another way of being, and another behavior that we can kind of call out and begin disrupting. And so, again, not to backpedal from the significance of whiteness, but just knowing that, again, that you can tease up with perfection how much of that is performance for others, performance for
Mm.
yourself, performance in different areas, and what's the metric, and is that metric the same for you than for other people? And so just as far as the complexity there in knowing it's again not all or nothing, that I could be totally bonded to my perfectionism and then 10 minutes later be free, and the main difference might have been who I was with or what the issue was. Me confessing I'm not a good cook, it takes a lot less vulnerability than saying I'm a bad teacher in that lesson. So I think for me, that whiteness, again, being able to just know in general with that relationship piece, I know for me, um, what I would share, and that's help with my colleagues who get touchy around whiteness, and particularly the fear of accountability, the fear of responsibility in that is acknowledging what's the difference in those pieces between privilege and advantage, between like power, and just distinguishing. There's a lot more layers there. So, I think that's where whiteness in many ways feeds by being invisible and
Yeah.
knowing that when it's invisible, that's when I always have to go backwards because I have a lot of white males who will say, well, I don't have any privilege, or because I had some disadvantage, it means I have no advantage. Or if you acknowledge some advantage, it means that it's dismissing your effort, it's dismissing your ability. And that's where sometimes I've had to go. Just that I guess a phrase I've had to come back to is we're not just colorblind, but we're identity blind.
Hmm. Hmm.
And so sadly, it's not just with color, but knowing that I almost feel like, oh, to not be sexist, I need to pretend that there's no sex or gender represented in the room. Or to pretend that class is not an issue and wealth is not an issue. I'm going to pretend I don't notice what my kids are wearing.
Hmm.
I'm going to pretend I don't notice, the technology they have. But that invisibility is seen as a value rather than a painful hurt impact. To just even acknowledge sometimes that, yeah, can I acknowledge that you're white or that you're male or you're educated, that I'm able-bodied, that I'm heterosexual. Me naming those things should not take away from my story. They should be adding strength to my story.
Yeah.
Uh, and I think that's one key defense is the idea if you see me, it must be an attack rather than seeing me. It could be a way of giving you space and giving you respect and giving you that honor.
Hmm.
I know I kind of feel like I'm rambling there, but for me, the goal is kind of those layers is just knowing that it takes a relationship to tie that in. If you have friends you never disagree with, I would kind of wonder about that friendship. If you have
Absolutely.
a colleague you never apologize to or you never take ownership, there's going to be a weakness to that relationship. And so, kind of like back with last year with you and Kate, just realizing you can't build a muscle if it never tears.
Hmm.
And you don't want to tear it for no reason. There's some intentionality there,
Hmm.
but just the fact that it tears doesn't mean it's the end. It
Yeah.
could actually be the growth that you've been waiting for, but are scared of.
The way that I've seen that come up is me having to, particularly when I'm at a school and I say the word whiteness. knowing immediately that people are triggered and then explaining when I say whiteness, I mean a system of advantage based on race, where those who are considered or deemed white have the advantages, and those who are othered, hereby black and brown, are disadvantaged, right? When I talk about that, it is hard for people to disassociate themselves as a white person from a system of whiteness.
Yeah.
That is really hard for folks. And in some ways I get it, right? Because it could seem like I haven't done the things that we're talking about. I've never owned other people. Uh I you know I do X, Y, and Z. I have this many friends. I do this. I volunteer here. I do these things. And 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 in that process, you're still telling me that there's a problem with me in my innate way of being. How can you tell me that I am it almost seems like you're attacking me and telling me I'm wrong when I haven't done anything. That can I at least do something before you tell me that I'm wrong? Um And in that process, I had to walk people through, okay, here's what we've been conditioned to believe. Here's what, you know, here's what the messages that our society is sending us constantly. And here's what we're going to believe, be trained to believe about yourself and about me. One of the ways that that particularly comes up is when I'm talking to a group and we're talking about the ways whiteness shows up and I say, my son's name is Shane. My daughter's name is Giselle. And there was intention behind that because I at least wanted to get my kids to the interview. Because if I named them something different, like a more quote unquote ethnic sounding name, now before you even get to the qualifications listed under, you're stuck on the name. You're identifying and then having a whole bunch of stuff come up for you based on your name. And what we have, if we've learned anything over the last, half a month with Katanji Brown Jackson, who is literally overqualified for the position, yet questioned and berated by people who are half as qualified, if that, than her. I say that to say that if you are not affected by the system that is set up, then it is easy for you to ignore because you wouldn't name your kid Marquand, chances are. You wouldn't name your daughter Katanji, chances are, right? Because those come from a different cultural background than yourself. And so you don't know the consequences that are innate in our system and our society of what that would mean for kids who look like me, right? Who might have a different zip code. Because let's say, where I'm from or where I'm teaching at in Trenton, New Jersey, there is a stigma attached to that. So if you say you're from Trenton and you're black, it's like, right?
Yeah.
Those are things that are completely missed on people you know, who are white. So when I say whiteness, it's like, oh, you're coming at me. No, I just don't think that you see it because you haven't had to.
Yeah.
And that the kind of disarming effect. Please go ahead, jump in there.
Yeah. I feel like, as you share that example with the names, there's so much there that's powerful because it's something we can all relate to with a name. Love and hate in our name or wanting to change our name, pronunciation. Day one, this a substitute, Key and Peele
Yeah.
clips. But uh, I think it's also a nice way to bridge into seeing the system. There's a system where I'm used to pronouncing names a certain way. Um, and also in that system, I think it allows you to also see, and this is where I'm thankful for like Layla's book, Me and White Supremacy, too, is seeing that these stereotypes and kind of embedded biases can also look positive. There can be like
Mm.
a fetishizing of certain names.
Yeah.
So you see like these celebrities taking names from another country, or and it's like clearly this isn't really part of your culture, but you think the name's pretty, or you think you like the name, um, and like this dissent or disagreement on like can they do that, can they not do that,
Right. Right.
um,
Right.
but like you were saying, I think when you connect it to a system, people know, yeah, if you have a three-syllable name as your first name, that's disruptive in our norm for society. Um, and just even hearing a first name as a last name. And so I think for maybe defensive touchiness, it just kind of, oh, yeah, I do know a friend who has a name that is hard to pronounce,
Yeah.
or when people aren't sure. And I think of tons of research, even if it's just anecdotal around, yeah, names and job applications. And will you get an interview? I think people recognize that.
Yeah.
Like Ben is a super normal name. In an interview application, am I going to write Benjamin and Ben?
Mm.
And
Yep.
again, those don't capture the degree at all of what Katanji's had to go through,
Yep.
um, and
Yep.
and the repetition of that. But I think this again, the name there, where it could look super positive of like, hey, I love your name, and it's almost this exotic fetishizing, um, and that could be just as harmful as maybe a negative bias, where you're saying kind of another expectation. But in her book, Me and White Supremacy, kind of teasing out that both of them serve as same function of othering. That
Mm.
whiteness is normal and the default, and this is not quote unquote normal.
Yeah.
It's other.
Yeah.
And so I think that connection for me, at least in the system, helps me see one way that I'm complicit in it, and that doesn't mean I'm a horrible, evil person. It
Right.
does mean I need to take ownership.
Yes.
So if I continue calling them by a different name or mispronouncing that, always, it's also showing like the importance of that relationship to me.
Yeah.
Um, if there's a system where I'm doing that, where that could easily be tracked and seen, then that's also a way of kind of calling out that it's not just a bad apple, but there are probably other people in that as well. And and I think it makes me sit with, hey, what kind of freedom and power did I have in naming my kids? Did I
Mm.
have to be thinking those questions that you did in naming your son and daughter? Not really. I had all sorts of advantages and privilege, where I didn't have to be thinking through my kids' livelihood and their future.
Yeah. Yeah. It makes me think of, I forget who said the quote, but it was basically this idea that if we, saw that there were bodies popping up in this river, right, and we began to look and saw that it was a problem that was happening time after time after time as we investigated, sooner or later we stop blaming the people and we blame what's happening with the river, right? Sooner or later you look at, why are all of these things, these results, why does it seem like this result is happening over and over again? And we question those things, we interrogate those things. um you know to do that though, you have to almost, one, know what we talk about when we talk about like systemic stuff, right? Like four eyes of oppression, we've talked about that in the past, right? So you got ideological, right? You got interpersonal, you got institutional, and you got internalized, right? and and the ground level, the foundational level, is this ideological oppression, right? It's the ground level from which everything else is birthed from, because it can't be a system, it can't be interpersonal if it's not first an idea that we have in our minds, right? And so um we associate certain qualities with, you know with favor, and we deem other ones as other, right?
Mhm.
um And then from that place we build out in our society, we build out uh you know institutional type of frameworks where these things happen. And one of the quickest ways that I get people to see it is like, all right, the next time you go to Walmart or Target, I want you to intentionally look for products that are made for the global majority. Intentionally. I want you to see where they are. Because 9 times out of 10, when I say that to somebody who's white, they don't know that there's really one aisle that we all go to where all that stuff is housed. Right. And the only time it really makes it to the front of Target is during Black History Month, because then it's commercialized. Right. It's not prominent and out there like that all the time. Um, and so I say all that to say that you have to see your place in the system. Kind of what you alluded to earlier
Mm-hmm.
is this idea of, I need to unpack and understand, um, I need to take ownership, but that doesn't make me a horrible person,
Uh-huh.
right? It doesn't make me a horrible person. So if you could um, walk us through your journey in that way.
Yeah, for sure. One thing that made it a bit different journey for me is I actually grew up around more people than normal in the Seattle area, where there were more diverse cultures, and again, even that diverse meaning non-white, interpretation, and so I think one side effect of having some friends on my street who were not white, or in a neighborhood, or playing basketball, was I kind of internalized this ideology again of like exceptionalism, like I'm white, but, or, and even having the comfort, again, quote unquote, of other friends basically saying like, oh, he's not like them.
Mm,
Um, and those phrases didn't come up a lot, but there was enough that I could kind of internalize. I know I'm not quite like them. I'm different. There's a sense of belonging, and as a kid, I think a lot of that was just internalized. Like we're friends, like we're cool. Like we can do this stuff. You can come to my house. I can go to your house. Um, but I think it took most of my life to just recognize that even if I've engaged in um, non-white relationships, there's kind of a danger to that proximity. Does that proximity negate me from that responsibility or from my complicity in the system? Um, and how do I feel sometimes when those differences pop up? When my friends talk about, and a lot of times we mention that privilege in terms of socioeconomic. I think what hit me as a teenager and in college was really just recognizing things I took for granted. So when I'm applying for a job, I just assume um, there's something wrong with my resume, maybe, rather than like my first name, or rather than what I'm wearing, or kind of how I show up. Um, and and so that exceptionalism um, made it a different journey than some of my other white colleagues. Where I teach right now, majority white population, most of them have no friends and haven't really worked with anybody who's not white. And so there's a big sense of kind of like, I don't know what I don't know. And so I think in some ways there's a catch 22. It took an extra layer of vulnerability for me to admit, hey, despite teaching for 3 years at a school where it was 98% not white, or despite growing up in a community that had more ethnic diversity, quote unquote, despite all of that engagement with me, living with different families around the world and doing humanitarian stuff before teaching, despite me studying culture and thinking through this, I was completely blind to this whiteness thing, kind of
mm,
blind to these kind of unconscious ways of being, and how I kind of internalized it being universal. Oh, universally, when people show discomfort, something's wrong. Rather than thinking, that might just be me. That might be more of a maybe a whiteness thing.
Mm.
That when my boss gets upset, I assume it's a bad thing, rather than other ways of being where you sharing how you're doing doesn't need to be an attack, or you sharing a need, or you sharing a feeling. It doesn't have to be a liability. And so that's where I'm really grateful to just, I guess, engage more critically for myself, but also with others in helping me dismantle piece by piece. So I've mentioned earlier, like the white supremacy traits, like 2 years ago, um, maybe 3 years ago, but even 2 years ago, when I heard white supremacy culture, that'd be like, not me, KKK, that's someone else with their pitchfork. But when I saw the list of traits by Tema Akun and her research under Kenneth Jones, those traits of perfectionism, the right to comfort, um, the power hoarding, the urgency, things that I didn't connect with race right away, but I knew that's been dehumanizing for me. I already have a stake in wanting that to go away. And so it created this traction. So I knew that I might not fully understand how all of that intersects with race and my unconscious biases, but I do know that these traits have not been working for me,
Mm.
and that they also have not been working for systems. Um, so that was helpful just in terms of a framework of seeing these traits. And then I think at heart level, it made me more open to read a book like Me and White Supremacy. Where
Mm.
before that title, I would have been like, oh, maybe those extreme KKK people. Instead of actually doing the definition, digging in and learning and unlearning, and then realizing, like, oh, wait, maybe I'm more of that white moderate MLK talks about. Maybe all my head game of like, oh, should I protest or should I not? Is it justified or not justified? And that lukewarmness really pissed off MLK. And that was more angering, and it was more confusing than those with their pitchforks.
Yeah.
Because at least they know where they stand and why, but
Yes,
I'm just
sir.
ambivalent, trying to, please, people pleaser, perfectionism, and all those traits are reinforcing my apathy, reinforcing my silence. Um, and so her book just hitting on the kind of insidious, raw, ugly side, um, and also calling in the love. That shame is not going to take me very far.
Yeah.
Shame might take me a little bit if I had, black students in my classroom. That would make me have a gut check on how am I teaching this history. But what her book helped with, and so many other people, is that even when I have no black kids in my classroom, am I still having them in the center of my mind when I'm teaching about positive things like these empires in Africa or these atrocities? Um, and am I recognizing the complexity of how am I showing up in teaching this, some white male? How can I decenter myself even if I don't have a physical presence reminding me to?
Mm.
Even if I don't have Bobby down the hallway um, as a colleague, but
Yeah.
recognizing this is dehumanizing me, and the system means it's also dehumanizing all of us to the extent that I should have a stake in this for all of us, even if those it's impacted the most personally are not in my room.
Mm. Mm. You know, to get to a point where you recognize the dehumanizing effect that whiteness will have even on white people, I think that takes a lot of unearthing because people tend to stop at the advantages, right? I believe it was Dr. Jane Elliott. Is that right? Dr. Jane Elliott.
I think
She
so.
um she did this experiment, or really this talk, and she said to the crowd, she said, now raise your hand if you would rather be a black person. And nobody raised their hand. And she's like, because you innately know that by raising your hand, you're volunteering for a life that is far harder than what you experienced. And you know, to get even to the point where it's not I'm I see what they're going through, aka sympathy, but moving towards I see what we are collectively dealing with because of how this whole thing has been set up. Empathy, um, I think is tremendous work. So I want to kind of switch gears a little bit and talk about the work, the anti-racist work that you've been doing. But to lead to that, I want to ask you this first. I want to ask you, what is it? What it if you were going back and you were talking to Ben at the beginning of this journey and you had to offer yourself advice to help navigate all that you kind of went through, whether it had been a hard lesson or maybe whatever it was, what advice would you give yourself and why?
Kind of connecting to that humanizing effort. I think even in this anti-racist work, there can be I just these insidious traits with what like just a remind. I guess I would want to give compassion to Ben 2 years ago and say this is going to be lifelong.
Hmm.
Um, Not to like excuse the work, but as far as I don't need to unnecessarily beat myself up when these things show up again.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, and I think that's for me where I think the perfectionism, I realize that some people can change their perfectionism, just to a different metric.
Yeah.
And so you can have, and you have this where like I've never used the word woke for myself. One, because I thankfully had some friends early on tell me about what that really means. But also because I just realized it could really easily become another competitive, comparative white supremacist system.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
I had these friends, and they're posting stuff like 6 posts a day, um, or they are out at every protest and they're driving across the country, and it's hard to know like should I be doing all of that or not doing all of that.
Yeah.
Um, and I think even with the internal work, again, just man, I messed up again today. And does that mean all of a sudden I'm not walking my talk, or that I'm a fake, or that it must be performative because I messed up? So I think it's been helpful for me to try to remind myself, and that's honestly where community comes in. When I've messed up and community has reminded me, like, Ben, like, we're still friends. Like, this isn't the end. Um, and yes, it did have an impact, and I needed you to apologize, but this doesn't need. I can kind of over empathize sometimes, like over empathize about the impact,
Yeah.
which is probably safer than sympathy, of course. But I just name that as far as recognizing for me. Um, I think for me that compassion piece creates space for more freedom. And so rather than just avoiding whiteness, am I pursuing liberation?
That's
And in
good.
the pursuit of liberation, then I can actually have space for joy. If I'm not pursuing liberation, if I'm just avoiding a certain identity, I'm avoiding a different checklist. I don't want the white supremacy stuff. Avoidance is not going to make me whole.
Hmm.
And so for me, that's been helpful. I would want to continue to offer that to myself of like, this is going to be ongoing. It's going to be messy, but also, I guess, try to normalize that discomfort. That when you mess up, um, it lean into those relationships. And
Mm.
I think again that community relational piece has um, help me really stay human or stay grounded. Even just thinking about like I'm not growing alone. I'm in a soil, and there are roots, and those roots we might not be connected at the surface. We might show up really different. You and me, Bobby, how we show up in this world, other side of the country. can look different, I'm really grateful for how our roots have connected.
Yeah.
Um, and those roots will grow in all sorts of messy ways. But that differentiated liberation is actually a beautiful thing rather than waiting for some formula, waiting for one plant that's growing rather than looking at the garden.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think that that's, you know, hitting the nail on the head because when we talk about just even that last analogy of like looking at the garden versus trying to find this perfect hybrid of plant that can grow in all temperatures, all climates, all right to kind of tease that out a little bit. Like the idea that we need to wait for something like that instead of pursuing the tending that is necessary for growth is, you know, it's almost like an offshoot, if you will, of the right to comfort or allegiance to just our comfort levels being assuaged. And so I'm grateful that you brought that up. You know, when we go from seeing ourselves to when we go to from seeing ourselves to then seeing it work all around us, I often think of um, you know, the Matrix, that scene with Neo, and he is at the end, you know, he's been finally proclaimed as the one. He realizes he's the one, and then he kind of gets up from being shot multiple times, which is just, you know, movie's sake. He gets up and he looks around, and all he sees is like this code all around him. Now, I was there the whole time, but now because he recognizes his place in this whole system, he begins to see it for what it is. And I kind of liken that to the process of, you know, of you know, white folks who get and understand and continue this ongoing work of understanding themselves. They now see it all around them, and it's like, oh my gosh, where was I? Why didn't I see this the whole time? And you can either like you can fall into despair or you can get to work, right? What has, because I know you, what has the getting to work process been like for you? Um, you know, take us behind the curtain, if you will. Like, what are some of the things that maybe people might not know in terms of the difficulties or just the things that you process through? What are some of the joys and successes?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, what immediately comes to mind for me is just the gratitude of other people's insight.
Ah,
And so, when people talk about anti-racist effort of I got my book and I end on the couch, um, is I will say it's a silver lining in that like books have been really helpful for me.
yeah,
And I think that like the internet, there's a way to stave off the emotional labor of hey Bobby, can you unpack all this for me? Then knowing like hey, actually maybe just digging into this honestly with intentionality, reading. We want to do more than survive.
yeah.
And so for me, knowing with other friends and colleagues is it's almost like tapping into a resource and then sharing these seeds. So knowing they might not have capacity, there might be some resistance um, to the whole book, but I can tease this interest by making an excerpt on grit and how can grit actually be racist. Um,
Mm,
and knowing that I can kind of have that in my back pocket for a few different colleagues or even for some students sometimes who are recognizing there's a system and people keep telling me to work harder and they're kind of denying the reality of a systemic constraint,
mm,
and knowing like okay, here's a seed that will tease them in. I've had a number of people that way who they read that excerpt and they're like I want more, I want more.
mm,
um, and beginning to see actually that system at school, yeah, I need more structures like this to help me dismantle. um, it's these seeds. Like this last year for me, a huge seed has been Goldie Muhammad's Cultivating Genius, and just this centering of joy. Just thinking, where am I making space for joy in this lesson plan? And telling my students that too. What do you do for fun? When
Yep.
have you smiled at school? What
Yep.
can you teach and show me about joy? Um, and making that joy a pursuit. And then also honoring the legacy of that, of saying, hey, this pursuit of joy and identity and criticality that are missing from our standards, like that's actually rooted in a very different approach to learning in these Black literary societies. Um, and being able to share those frameworks with people who, in their heart, a lot of times recognize I want more, but can't articulate it, then knowing Goldie has articulated this and she's given a great framework
Hmm.
to give you traction
Yep.
on it. I think of the traction even from other co-conspirators. Just today, another hat is teaching future teachers. So later today, I'm actually going to use an excerpt from Briebekauer um, to to dig in those ideologies. So let's look at her case studies she analyzes. Last week we looked at with in higher ed graduate class just teacher candidates, and let's look at these tools of whiteness. How are these showing up in your placement? How are these showing up in your own school history? How are you seeing this show up in conversations with each other, or even in the program? Like, what are some
Yeah.
ways that this could kind of be embedded? And so that's a grand like tools here where someone may not read all of this. My students in the class, we intentionally only assign like one book, but then I intentionally bring in pieces and seeds where, and then having like Goldie Muhammad came and spoke to my students.
Yep.
And they're just captivated where I'm like, I cannot be Goldie. I want you to see Goldie. How can I decenter myself in that graduate class rather than again being a gatekeeper, but saying, how could my syllabus reflect this value?
Yeah.
I can't change who I am, and I can kind of still invite you in. It doesn't mean that I need to disappear. That divesting doesn't mean disappearing, but
Right.
that divestment does mean removing the space. It does mean honoring and celebrating Black excellence and acknowledging the again the deficit narrative where I know I love that around whether it's Shauna. I know that Kwame highlights this a lot too, just around what is taught as universal or normal. Is it just Piaget? Is it just Vygotsky? Or are you bringing in other voices? And that's where I've had to be vulnerable with my grad students and saying, I didn't get this. I wish I had this. I'm
Yeah.
embarrassed to not know this. But all of you should be looking at this person, looking at the research, digging into almost like this third space relationally of how are you showing up. And so even like Ratchetdemic with Chris Emden,
Phenomenal
um,
book.
again, it's what I loved about reading it was um, it was very accessible to me and yet was not centering me.
Mm,
And so, yes, I am part of that story of so many characters he highlights, but all the way through is Black excellence, um, Black joy, Black perseverance, um, and it doesn't need to be a comparison, but he's just acknowledging showing up has a cost, and those four eyes now have stories behind them of oppression
yeah.
and advantage, and being willing to sit with that. But that again can be a seed when he just has this excerpt around how was he showing up as a tall teenager. What are ways he had internalized his own sense of identity, and the layering of that I can never relate to. There are pieces I can relate to, but the distinction in a name for him, what was the nickname he got, and what's the power of internalizing that? Um, so all those resources for me could have just stopped at the couch.
Yeah.
But one way I try to honor the impact on my own story is passing on those seeds
Yeah.
and helping those roots spread. Um, and so those are just some examples. And then of course, just relationships like you, like just being able to connect. We have a connected in person, but there's an accountability of, hey, what am I learning? How am I growing? a big piece for me over a year ago was a group with Teachers for Good Trouble, where again it was advocating, and it was telling that who was most involved in that group was mostly non-white educators,
Mhm.
and knowing like what's that saying about our system? Who is caring about the injustice of testing?
Yep.
Who sees that as a problem? And then also seeing, um, how are all of them, how is that community still embracing me? They're not seeing me as a liability that has to be permanently apologetic.
Yep.
um, they've become friends, and they've also, called me out, and but they've also invited me in, that you don't have to disappear.
Yep.
And so that's been a helpful perspective. Again, just kind of the larger context in Oregon is mostly white. Most of my classrooms are white. The graduate program I'm teaching in is mostly white. And that reality can make it harder to know where to start. And so I think it's been helpful for me to have that, to see, disruption and even interruption as a kindness. It's really kind when someone interrupts me, even mispronouncing a name. I don't have to see that as an attack. It could be an invitation for relationship.
Yep.
The fact that they even interrupted me could be a sign that they trust I care. And that's where I know some students who won't interrupt anymore. They don't really think that it will matter. They don't
Mm.
think it's worth pronouncing their name correctly. Um, so even that name thing, kind of back to where you had shared with your kids, is you had to think through that, and I didn't need to as a father. You
Yep.
had to think through, will someone mispronounce their name? Will they prejudge their name? Will all these unconscious biases pop up before they even speak to my children?
Absolutely. Absolutely. You know, um, I love the analogy of, seeds of disruption, right? I love the analogy of sowing seeds, particularly because, you know, over the last year and a half, I've been trying to get my lawn to look like some of my neighbors out here. They are, green grass, perfectly manicured. It's kind of like the thing, right? And I inherited a lawn that is not like that. And one of the things that I've had to do continuously in this process of trying to nurse it back to health is this process of overseeding, right? And so you have to take a rake, put it on the surface of the grass, and move it back and forth to agitate the soil. And once you agitate it enough, you've created grooves where the seeds can now grow, because now you just throw them down. And it wasn't that grass wasn't there before. It was that you were seeding so that more grass could grow and more health can be sustained over the summer months and things like that. And the process of overseeding is what really maintains the health of your lawn. I've learned this over the last year and some change because I've had to. Um, but the thing about seeds is once you place them into the ground, you don't see the work that they're doing until they spring back up, right? And so the work that you're doing, you may not even see the fruit of it, but it's the seed that begins to germinate underneath the soil that does the work and springs up in its time. And so, I just want to name that, and I know you don't do it for applause or affirmation or anything like that, but I do think that there are many who are in positions of influence, however that looks like for them, and won't even dip into the bag to toss some seed because they don't know that they got to open the bag and start. Right.
Yeah.
So I want to name that and say thank you for your work, because even particularly in places that are majority white, this is the kind of education that they deserve. One that's going to open up their eyes to the world in such a way that they're going to make it better, push for change, and grow. Um, I wanted to ask a final question and then kind of open it up for you to share anything you have going on and how people can touch base with you. Um, But my question is, if you had three wishes, three liberatory wishes that you think could help change the face of just liberatory movement in general, what would they be?
Um, hmm. Well, the first one that immediately came to mind is I would love to see it. It's almost like I think I'm imagining this. I want to center student voices, so it would be a wish of like hearing stories from students. And I'm
Mm,
almost imagining like how many teachers might not be tapping into TikTok, but if it was that sort of thing where you just, if every educator had a video testimony of, that they knew would just call them into this work.
yeah.
Um, I feel like so often kids have these stories, but they don't feel safe to share.
Mm,
I think in particular in my context, there are so many students of color who um, just because of the system have have hidden themselves. If there was a way to be able to see and hear and learn to really cherish and be called into these experiences, um, and so that'd be kind of one wish of just being able to, if every educator could have 10 minutes where they were able to kind of be called into and inspired through just the experience of kids.
mm,
Um, that'd be one kind of big wish, which is kind of almost like a package deal when you have a genie. You're like, can I get more wishes out of that? Um, but yeah, just being able to, I think, be captured by student stories, because I think so often I hear educators being called into this work because of metrics or
yep.
because of optics, um,
Yep.
rather than actually students and their stories. And, because then it becomes much more of a gardener nurturing than cultivating this genius, again, from Dr. Goldie, um, rather than what can easily become, how can I manipulate your experience to justify my actions? Which I think so
Mm,
often is the industry of educators, to keep your
yeah.
job, to get that promotion. So student experience videos, well, they would be awesome to just disrupt and invite. Another wish, um, and this is, just big picture, totally dreaming, is I would love for there to be um, like a thriving educator cohort in schools. Like if there was actually like state funding to be like, we want to help you stay human in a draining job.
Yeah.
That would be like self care, mental health, um, just even, again, not wanting that to be cookie cutter for each placement. So how often is like yoga framed as universal when maybe that's just more of a whiteness refreshment, um, rather than actually trying to honor a different way of resetting and being refreshed.
Yeah.
Um, so I think, just loosely, I think of Thriving Educator Project. Kwame had this great educator on kind of sharing about thriving education and what would that look like when so often we're just trying to survive this year instead of thriving. So that'd be a wish for like an infrastructure to actually sponsor and support, rather than, hey, Bobby, here's a $10 gift card. That's going to make up for all the work you've done this year. Thank you. Um,
Hmm.
you know, and then, probably have a different three tomorrow, but, the third one I would say is a wish. Um, I wish. Um, this again, I think if every teacher had another prep just to enjoy kids. So saying if
Mm,
you had an extra prep built in your schedule to build connection outside of your curriculum, what would you do with that time? Um, and that would be awesome.
I love it. That's I love that. That is great. Just to enjoy kids, just another prep. Yeah. I think about particularly your number two, and here recently, I've been just kind of taking stock and asking some of my teacher friends about just their thoughts and ideas, and what I'm really hoping and working towards is seeing what I've been building with the Liberated Educator cohort to become something that can be what you're talking about, a model that can go into schools where it's a year long, you know, um, work that is done together and asynchronous, where you can like learn on your own and then put some things back together. And we're talking to the teacher coaches about what this looks like and how to implement it. And then we're coming back together and talking about the progress and what's working, what's not. And we're holding space for one another. And so it lives and breathes and it moves, um, kind of the educational landscape forward so that we can feel levels of success and go from merely just surviving to thriving, like you're talking about. Um, and so I don't know. As you said it, it made me think of it, and it was like an almost like confirmation for me to keep going. You know.
Yes. Yeah.
Um, and so, listen, I want to say, Ben, that we've been rocking with each other for now, what, almost going on 2 years, and I feel like, you've been in my corner. We have held each other up. You've asked insightful questions, um, and I've grown tremendously by being your friend. And so, I want to say that publicly. You know, I appreciate our friendship. I appreciate you, brother, for what you mean, and just the ability for you to just be vulnerable and say like, yo, this is messy, and I see even this stuff in my own life, stuff that I've unpacked with anti-blackness and this and that. And you can just say that and know that we're not like, it's not going to change, our the dynamic of our relationship, because that's the reality. Like, we know we've all been conditioned to do that, right? And there's space and grace to move and grow. And so I appreciate you, um, dearly. I want to ask my and give you space to respond, but also, could you plug anything you have going on and let people know how they can connect with you?
Yeah. Oof. Yeah, I think it'd be great to just tap in, honestly, just to communicate and collaborate. If you want to connect with me, on Instagram is just ben.bruhn, so ben.bruhn. It's kind of new space for me, but it's been great to connect and collaborate that way. I really try to just amplify other people's brilliance and share things along the way. And so that's one space. You can always, through that, I can give you my email, and I love to just connect with people, hear their stories, um, things that are going on for me. A lot of it this year, I feel like, is almost like a plant, is kind of at the root level. What can I control? There's so much we can't control in our
Yes.
lives. But it has been helpful. I feel like as things are thawing out from COVID, begin some collaborative work in my school, in my district, at the my state region. Um, so I think as far as contact, Instagram probably the entry point. These videos, I would just say they've been super helpful for me to see how Bobby, you've expanded this sense of liberation and trying to honor the complexity of it, and then also recognizing it shouldn't be overwhelming. I can
Mm.
pursue liberation right now, and it doesn't need to be a wait until or after, maybe after the school year, after the summer. Um, and so that's what I'm excited about with your cohort. So I'd rather kind of plug that because that's going on right now, and I feel like that's really empowering and liberating. Um, yeah, I don't have anything specific coming out. I know that Bobby, you and I are going to be rolling into Melanie Duke's book club that we're going to roll into. Just a great book. So I would just give a shout out to her book, My Freedom Journey. And I think it's another great space with intentionality for reflection to begin kind of seeing your journey and how to move through this world where um, joy is resistance. And so, yeah, I don't have a lot going on. More I do, but it's nothing too public. It's again more like you were saying, Bobby. It's kind of under the surface and behind the scenes, but
Yeah,
I do enjoy collaborating and learning from people, and so I invite that communication.
absolutely. Absolutely. Um, Ben, thank you for sharing space and spending this time. And I know that your work and even your words here will continue to do what you've been doing and planting seeds, and seeds that may grow underneath the surface that you may not see, but seeds that grow nonetheless. Um, so thank you for sharing space, brother. And listen, y'all, if you're tapped in, we thank you for sharing the space with us. We thank you for, spending this time. This is what we do here on the lab. We advance liberation one conversation at a time. My guest is Ben, um, my brother Ben. I affectionately call him. And so thank y'all, and we'll see you on the next side.